Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a ruling by a Tel Aviv court, which has rejected an appeal by the Islamic Council of the city of Jaffa about a 200-year-old Muslim cemetery that had been discovered during construction work not too long ago. Now, when that graveyard was discovered, even Christian priests, as well as even rabbis, came out, at that time at least, to say that no, that should not be desecrated and something should not be built on top of it. Nevertheless, now the court has gone against the appeal of the Jaffa Council, as I said, the Islamic Council, and has now allowed for that to go through. Now, this is not the only such example within the occupied territories of such instances where graveyards have been built over. We've also had a museum of tolerance, quote unquote, which was built over a graveyard and cemetery in Jerusalem also. So what does this signify at this point in time? Why is there no respect for cemeteries even in this amongst these tensions, if I may call them that, between the Israelis and Palestinians at this time? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Gideon Levy, who is a journalist. He's joining us now from Tel Aviv. We're also joined from Birmingham by Professor Kamel, who is a political analyst. He's also the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Movement in the UK. He's an academic at the University of Birmingham as well. Kamel and Gideon, thank you both for your time today. Kamel, let me start with you, if I may. What do you make of this latest instance? Of course, as I said, this is not the first such example. Nevertheless, it's quite disturbing, isn't it, that even a graveyard, the sanctity of a graveyard is not being respected?
Yes, I mean, it's as you say, not the first incident of its kind, but we should remember that 3 days after the occupation of the old city of Jerusalem, the Israeli forces demolished the Moroccan quarter, which was a 770-year-old quarter. Demolished it, cleared the people out. There were mosques there. They made that was very soon after the occupation of Jerusalem. Then you look at how the Israeli authorities treat all sorts of Muslim buildings, not only cemeteries. Again, turning a mosque in the city of Safed, where Mahmoud Abbas comes from, actually, that's his original city, turning it into a bar. And then you look at the currently working in Tiberias, Lake Tiberias, Buhayra Tabariya, a mosque there again being turned into a museum. So the sort of disrespect for the feelings of the Palestinian population is there for all to see. Right from the outset. So this is, as you say, a continuation of this. It is saying Israel is only for Jews, both in terms of if they could find a way of moving the Palestinians out, they would, and they might try to do that. But in the meantime, they turn mosques and cemeteries into other structures or structures for the other. And at the same time, they deny the Palestinians the right to return to their homes. So it's a combination of not allowing the Palestinians there to feel that they're an integral part of society with some rights, but also to say this is a Jewish homeland rather than a Palestinian or Muslim homeland.
So then, Gideon, how are you supposed to then square this with Israel's claim that it wants everyone to live side by side in peace, tolerance, and harmony? I mean, that by definition requires you to respect other sanctities, doesn't it?
I'm not sure that Israel is even saying it, but you missed one value, and this is equality. It's very nice to ask to live in peace, but you have, first of all, to live in justice and equality. And this Israel never offered to the Palestinians and has no intention to offer a real equality in rights, in everything. I think our topic should be a little bit wider, because I must tell you, I'm much more worried about the attitude and the lack of respect of Israel toward the living ones rather than the dead ones. Let's go back. In 1948, Israel evacuated and totally destroyed over 400 Palestinian villages. In many of those cases, the only remain were the cemeteries, which for me has a relatively little meaning, because I would like to see the villages stay and not only the cemeteries. And now even the cemeteries are being demolished here and there in many places, and you should see it in the overall framework, in the overall context. And the overall context is, as my colleague just mentioned from London, the overall context is erasing the past, erasing the Palestinian presence and Palestinian history and Palestinian heritage and Palestinian emotions in these parts of land. And Jaffa is just a small example, because would it be a Jewish cemetery, I can assure you nothing would have been built there, even though one factual detail must be mentioned. This specific cemetery, they claim, was evacuated already decades ago from its graves. I don't know how correct it is, but that's what the authorities say here. But for me, it doesn't matter, because for me, the only question is, how would they treat a Jewish cemetery? And the answer is very clear.
So then, this sort of policy then, Kamel, along with what we have, the reality presently, right? We have that Trump peace plan, quote unquote, in place, seemingly, though that seems to have reached a stalemate from the beginning. It came almost dead on arrival. And then we have the possibility of annexation of the West Bank and Jordan Valley. I mean, put all together, this is an all-out war, if I may use that term, right, against Palestinians at this point in time?
Yeah, the other thing to remember, and to add to what Gideon said, is, of course, there's equality in the number of people who live on the land. There are about 6 million or so Palestinians and 6 million Jews who are living on the same land. But when you listen to the plans that Trump comes up with, you think that the Palestinians are just a small minority. The Palestinians aren't. They're equal even in number at the moment. And of course, Israel uses the demography in certain places. For example, in Jerusalem, it wants to maintain a certain percentage, maximum percentage of Palestinians in Jerusalem, because that might disturb the demography that it wants there. But the general message is as follows. The Palestinians are a lesser people as a whole, wherever they are. They are discriminated against within the 1948 areas, Israel proper. Their homes are demolished even within these areas. The Bedouin Israelis in the Negev are being forced to move into small Indian reservations, whether they like it or not, and they're told it's good for them. To the extent that you have a village, an unrecognized village, and that's important, in the Negev, called al-Hiran, that Israel wants to depopulate, to move the Palestinians off, and build on top of it a settlement called Hiran, only for Jews. I mean, that, if you like, to confirm Gideon's point about equality, if you're doing that to your own citizens, how on earth do you see the other Palestinians who live in the occupied territories as people with rights, inalienable rights? And how do you then even move towards thinking about those Palestinians who live in refugee camps and the fact that they have a right to return that is enshrined in international law? So it is very much about that. And I'm sure Gideon has read, as I have, an article by someone who was to be really quite a staunch Zionist, Peter Beinart, who's beginning to talk, and people like him who come from a very different starting point, to talk about equality as really important even for the values of Judaism.
Gideon, I'll give you the word before I let you both go. The Israelis would argue, Gideon, as you well know, that, listen, we even have Arab Israelis represented in the Knesset. Why is it that everyone keeps talking about the lack of equality in Israel? You've heard Israeli officials, one after the other, always talk about how the Arabs are treated well within Israel proper, if we may say that. Of course, there's a lot of arguments against that, but how do you square that with then the reality that the Arab, even Israelis, are not actually treated equally?
Look, there is a representative of Afro-Americans and maybe even Native Americans in the Congress, and this doesn't mean, and nobody claims seriously, that the United States is an equal system for all its citizens. Go to the jails in the United States and you see the answer. Same here in Israel. Israel, I'll do it very brief, has 3 regimes, and we have to realize it. One regime, which is a liberal democracy for its Jewish citizens, citizens, one regime which is a very discriminative regime for its Israeli-Palestinian citizens, around 2 million people or less, 20% of Israel, less than 2 million. And the third regime is a very clear apartheid system in the occupied territories. Once you have an apartheid system in part of your land, you cannot be considered as a democracy, and you can't talk about equality because this stain covers up everything else. So we have to realize that if we want ever to solve the problem, it should start exactly here, in this value of equality. And Israel is as far as possible from really perceiving the Palestinians as equal human beings, even not equal citizens, even not equal human beings. Here it starts and here it will end.
Very well. We'll have to leave there as a final point. We appreciate both Gideon and Kamel for their time today, and of course, their expert insight. Gideon, they're speaking to us from Tel Aviv, and Kamel is speaking to us there from Birmingham in the UK. You know, when you hear about these sorts of things, when you read about any graveyard anywhere in the world being desecrated, and we've had a couple of Jewish graveyards, for example, in Europe being desecrated, that is just as condemnable as the graveyards being desecrated and destroyed within the occupied territories, these graveyards being of Muslims, basically, 200-year-old graveyards. No one's being buried there right now, but nevertheless, they are sacred at the same time. And has this situation gotten so out of hand that even the dead cannot be respected at this point in time? Gideon made a good point, of course, that he's less worried about the dead and more worried about the living. And there's a great point to be made there, that we need to, of course, certainly view how the living are being treated right now, the living Palestinians, that is. But nevertheless, even the dead, I mean, that's something that for a lot of us around the world, regardless of our values, we do respect all of our dead. If we go beyond that and break those chains, then what kind of humanity, if any, do we have left? Is it okay for the Israelis to continue building over cemeteries? That seems to be, at least to me, a step too far. I'll be back with the next segment after this. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss how Germany has now taken over the EU's rotating presidency for the next 6 months or so. This comes, of course, at an important time as the EU is grappling very much with the fallout from the coronavirus pandemic and how it has hit specific countries, specific member states, that is. Italy, of course, at the beginning, we remember, was hit quite hard. And at the same time, it seemed at that time, at the very least from the outside, in that Italy was not receiving as much help as it may have wanted from its EU partners and from the EU as a whole. Now, there's also this talk of a fund to support EU member states. We have the Frugal Four members as well, including Austria and the Netherlands also, who have spoken out against that without conditions, that is, on those who receive any such funding from the EU as a whole to be able to, of course, help their economies further down the line. Now, this is, of course, on top of the fact that even in the past, we've had issues between EU member states over divisiveness, such as issues over migrants entering the country as well. And we've seen how the unequal share of those migrants has also created tensions within EU member states as well. Remember, Greece, Italy, and others have had many issues in trying to, of course, deal with the migrant issue now on top of the one with the COVID-19 as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Amy Verdun, who is a full professor of European politics and political economy at Leiden University and University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. She's currently joining us from Leiden in the Netherlands. Joining us from Vienna, Austria is Marcus Hall, who is the head of research and analysis at Vienna East Consulting. Marcus and Amy, thank you both for your time today. Amy, let me start with you. Germany is coming in, as I said, at an important time into the EU presidency. Will Merkel be able to work her magic this time around? Will she be able to unite Europe?
So everybody very much hopes that she's able to do that. She has a very distinguished record as being one of the leading members in the EU for a longer period of time. And she's also been present at the previous crisis when the financial crisis hit Europe. And there was also a need for some solidarity. So observers think that this is a time for her to show her legacy capacity and to really bring the Europeans together. So there's a good hope that she might be putting in everything it takes to bring this off to a good end.
But, you know, Marcus, the issues on the table are not easy to overcome, right? As I mentioned in the introduction, we have the Frugal Four, including Austria as well, who do not want funding to be handed out without conditions. can the likes of Germany, France, and others who support this sort of funding overcome that with those member states?
I think on a one-off basis, probably yes. But I think in the longer term, there are many disputes to be had. I think more generally, the situation reflects the political polarization between the various fringes of Europe at the moment. On the one hand, you have the Frugal Four, whose electorates aren't in favour. There's no majority for funding without conditions. So that's dangerous for the parties in power there who are worried about far-right populists. But then, of course, you have countries like Italy that have been very hard hit, not only by the pandemic, but also the economic circumstances of the last 10 years. And in those countries as well, there is no majority for the sort of reform that the Frugal Four would want. So the situation is a very delicate one, and it's hard to imagine it not ending up in gridlock some way down the line.
Amy, impression on the part of some I've understood vis-a-vis Germany has been that it has bullied or been able to get its way a lot because it has a much larger economy than other member states if we compare them. Do you think that Germany is being able to overcome that and will be able to then convince, as I said, the Frugal Four to sign on to this sort of funding? I mean, I imagine they would look to Germany and say, okay, you have a much better economy than us, respectively. You can probably afford this, but we don't want to just hand out cash, essentially, without conditions attached to it.
Interesting about the German case is that it was for the longest time much more in line with those of the what you call the Frugal Four, the stance held at the moment by the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark, and Sweden, and also to some extent Finland. And it's just made a U-turn in that sense by now supporting a much more transfer union kind of stance. In principle, Germany has always had a very pivotal position in matters regarding economic and monetary union, which isn't only because of its large economy, but also because of its record in monetary policy surroundings. So it has had a very strong central bank and the economy also to back it up. Now, I think the members who are paying per capita more than others into the EU budget have been wanting to say that any monies paid on those who are needed most need to be accompanied with some kind of reform plan that need not be like austerity measures, but also trying to deal with some of the issues that are legacy issues in these countries. So I think a compromise would need to address those various issues of finding a way to help these countries also make adjustments so that they move into the sort of 21st century on a lot of different angles, and giving them some funding in the short run for sure, but maybe also looking towards reform of economic and monetary union. We'll need more steps in the months to come.
Marcus, another part of Merkel's speech, or not big part, important part of Merkel's speech, was also her mention of Brexit and how those negotiations are going. We all know those trade talk negotiations at the very least are not going very well. She said the EU should very much be ready for a no deal Brexit at the end of this year vis-a-vis a trade deal, as I said. How would that affect the European Union?
I mean, it would certainly have an impact, a big impact on the European Union. You know, something like 53% of imports into the UK are from the EU, so it is a major trading partner for the EU. However, the EU is a much larger economy than the UK. It has more ability, more capacity to absorb that kind of shock, even in the current circumstances. I don't see the UK being in the same position, given that it is so dependent on the EU market for its exports, and it won't be able to diversify its trade partners to the extent that it will be able to compensate for the lost business, for the lost revenue that arises from what would effectively be a no-deal Brexit, no matter how Boris Johnson's government try to package it. I think another issue is also that the EU faces in Boris Johnson's government not so much an administration as a PR operation, and they've been very slippery on a number of points to which the Conservative Party themselves have previously committed. So, for example, the role of the European Court of Justice in any post-Brexit legal arrangement. So I think it's a very open question as to whether the Boris Johnson administration is engaged in a Freudian death drive, so to speak, or whether they are really serious about going through with this.
Your thoughts are on that, Amy, because, you know, this is also a question of the image of the EU, right, when it comes to Brexit. I mean, when the Brexit vote originally happened, of course, we had alarm bells going off in Brussels, certainly, about what this would mean for EU unity as a whole down the line. Do you think that the EU has been able to overcome that threat, if I may use that term, to its unity amongst its member states? And that what exactly do you think as well would a no deal Brexit completely mean for the bloc?
I agree. When the Brexit happened, it was a big shock to the system, and the concern was that more countries would follow the UK's lead, in the sense that they might also want to leave, or that larger parts of the population would have very much a sympathetic perspective on sort of a leave campaign within their own nation states. And the remarkable thing is that the EU has kept so much of a one single line towards the United Kingdom. And so that, in a sense, this sort of fear of breakaway within the EU at this point in time really hasn't happened. What concerns may still come down the road, I think what was said already, is one of the big ones. It's going to be a challenge to the UK simply because of the UK EU being a different size. But a couple of other things are coming up now as well that worries some of the member states that are closest to the UK or deal with the UK more than others. And that has to do with a different legal environment or a different social policy or tax policy that could emerge in a country that's not in the EU, so that a level playing field will disappear. And so just in the Netherlands, they've been confronted with Unilever moving its headquarters to the United Kingdom. And the question is whether Shell will go there too. And in part, the question is whether those companies are considering going to the United Kingdom because of lower social policies, lower taxes, or other environments that could privilege big business over the workers, or other regulatory environments. So that's a concern that the EU needs to deal with as well.
Indeed. Mark, the final word. When it comes to also, I know we haven't touched upon this in this conversation, but just quickly, if you can, about military, unity within within the entire bloc, right? There's a talk of the U.S. Walking away or having some troops withdraw from Germany. The likes of Poland and others, even Latvia, I believe, now has said that we would welcome those troops into our countries. I mean, there is this whole back and forth, right, between the EU and the U.S. as well. Do you think that the EU as a bloc will remain united on that issue, or will we see gaps within the bloc on the issue of NATO and troop placements, U.S. troop placements, etc.?
I think it's probably likely to be some sort of hybrid. I mean, Trump has been attempting to play divide and rule with respect to NATO within the bloc to varying degrees of success. I think, of course, there will be many countries that will remain particularly tethered to NATO, and there will be disagreements on whether to go more in the direction of a European defence force. There are measures in place that will move towards integration in the defence area, such as a joint military command and so on within the EU. All of this, of course, is being championed mainly by France and to a certain extent also by Germany now. I think that this is probably going to become the norm in the longer term, that Europe will have to have a consolidated defence union in order to be able to reduce its reliance on the US, which has become an increasingly unreliable partner with respect to NATO. It's possible, of course, that if Joe Biden is elected, that issue will ease somewhat. But I think in the longer term, US public opinion, US foreign policy has fundamentally changed, and its defence policy as a result in NATO and the EU more generally will also change with that.
All righty, we'll have to leave a final word, but of course we appreciate both Marcus and Amy for their time today and their expert insight, and we appreciate them for putting this all into context for us, because, the presidency of Germany may possibly signal something positive for the EU, where Germany may be able to come in and unite everybody. That is, though, of course, a tall order, because there's a lot on the table for the EU members to not agree upon. It comes down to the migrant issue, to funding, coronavirus funding, that is, coronavirus bonds, however you want to term them. The frugal four countries, as I mentioned, want conditions attached to any funding that may be handed out to any member state, saying that there would need to be certain reforms, there would need to be checks and balances, which makes sense to an extent, of course. No one wants to hand out money for free, even within member states of a bloc that you're part of. Will Germany be able to do this? This is Merkel's essentially last dance, as we may say. She may very well be able to build her legacy from this moment onwards for the next 6 months. And we'll, of course, keep a very close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss how neo-Nazis in the UK, according to a report by the Commission for Countering Extremism, are now actually encouraging their followers or their members to actually go out and purposefully infect Jews, Muslims, and other minorities as well. Now, this is on top of course, fake news that was sent out saying that the likes of Muslims and others were actually spreading the coronavirus to begin with. At this time, in the middle of a pandemic, one would think that society should be, of course, uniting. But nevertheless, it seems, in fact, that hate groups of all kinds, not just neo-Nazis, by the way, are taking very much advantage of the situation to try to actually increase their membership and to increase the reach of their hateful ideologies. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're now joined by Eric Heinze, who is a professor of law and humanities at Queen Mary University of London. He's joining us now from London. Eric, thank you very much for your time today. How disturbing is it, Eric, that, as I said, even at a time when you would think humanity would be coming together, we have hate groups who are actually sort of, taking this as a sign that they can actually breed further hate?
Yeah, well, of course, it's very disturbing. And naturally, the main social media sites have to become a bit more active.
Indeed. So, when we're talking social media sites, we've had just recently, as you well know, a boycott of those who advertise on Facebook, big corporations doing that as well because of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, and even Donald Trump and some of his posts online. Do you think that is the way to go? Do you think that'll have any effect? So far, Facebook, at least, has been resisting that.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't overstate the effect that bans and censorship can have. The number one priority is always just dissemination of correct information. Hate groups are not necessarily so dangerous if they're simply among themselves and if they're being watched. They become much more dangerous if they can spread information without contradiction.
Indeed, and had for a while now, right? Incorrect information being handed out. I mean, we had a lot of people would say even the Brexit campaign was full of misinformation also about specific minorities within the UK. Is it a matter of, do you think the government's not doing enough? Like, who needs to take the responsibility at this time?
Well, government and media. You can't really separate the two. I think we focus so much on censorship and banning that we often simply disregard the affirmative, the much more proactive roles that government and media can play in simply disseminating more accurate and fairer information.
Right, and I wonder what you make of how much of an effect politicians' words have, right? So we've had in the past Boris Johnson, he has endless quotes that we can probably refer to, which would be seen as offensive by anybody, really, referring to women in niqab as letterboxes. And then we've had the example across the seas as well in the U.S., where we've had Donald Trump saying Islam hates us. All of that feeds into hate, doesn't it?
Yeah, certainly, yeah.
And so do you get, with the fact that feeding into hate, but yet people keep electing these sorts of men into office, does that say something about the society itself?
Well, it's hard to say what we mean by keep electing, right? Boris Johnson is now only in his first term. We don't know if he'll be reelected. Donald Trump, we don't know if he'll be reelected. In the case of Trump, there's some reason to think that a lot of the support was simply a kind of protest against the establishment. Obviously, there are a lot of far-right groups throughout the West and elsewhere that have not come into power, that have a certain base, that have a certain following. If we look at, for example, Marine Le Pen in France, she certainly has a strong base, but the fact is she's been trying now for years to gain elective office, and she hasn't succeeded. And we could name other examples in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Scandinavia. So I wouldn't say that these people keep getting elected to very high office, but I think you're certainly right that they have a base of support, a populist base, which we can't underestimate.
Indeed, no, you pointed that out. That's a very fair point, certainly. And, for many, of course, when it comes down to hate, right? So if we're talking about the Muslims in the UK, for example, we had the Prevent program, we've had other counter-terror programs, as you well know, which have come under criticism also, that have, according to Muslims themselves, unfairly targeted them, right? Made them the other in the situation, which should then be feared and, or, everyone else must always be suspicious of them. Why isn't it that we're working together more? Because certainly I would imagine that all British citizens, or the vast majority of British citizens, regardless of their faith, would want their country to be safe and would very much point out if they saw something which would then make them or their own family members also unsafe in that country.
Well, I guess my own view, if you look at, I think, the states that have the best records in terms of human rights across the board, and particularly if you look at a nation like Germany now, right, which is generally respected for its human rights record, despite some criticisms one might make. If you look at the way Germany deals with its past, I think overwhelmingly you win public education through an open and critically minded education, which starts young. Right. I think if we take the German example, children in Germany from a very young age start learning about the wartime atrocities, about the Holocaust and so forth. And then that education is constantly reinforced. You also see this in German media, in documentaries, in museum exhibits. It's all across the board. Most, if not virtually all, German school children are actually taken to concentration camps, right, as part of sort of school visits in order to enhance their education. This is something that every country can do, right? Very few countries have perfectly clean histories.
Yeah.
And yet often in school, what children learn is a glorified past or a victim past. We, in most countries throughout the world, I would say there's not enough focus on how, on the darker sides of one's own country's history. That's what's called critical thinking. Mm-hmm. And I think when that kind of critical thinking is taught from a young age through a critical look at history, then a lot of these problems of tolerance, of misinformation, of prejudice, of bigotry, a society learns to deal with more maturely, and hate groups then stay as a minority.
I'll give you the final word. We can obviously see when hate gets out of hand, right? So we've seen the Christchurch attacks not too long ago. We've seen other such attacks against Jews as well in Germany, the Halle synagogue attack as well. There's so many examples of this very much translating into violence. A, do you think that the general public is aware of this very major threat to enough awareness exists within them? And B, that authorities are doing enough to possibly stop such attacks from occurring again?
You can always do more. You know, it's never enough. I think that, it's only really in the past few years, say in the past decade or maybe past 15 years, that the real power and the dangerous power of social media have been unleashed. And this often also during periods of austerity, when governments are not often channeling resources as strongly as they ought to do into combating these sorts of problems. And so you can always do more. More always needs to be done. And that's why I come back to the idea that the best action is proactive rather than reactive, is, again, in a word, public enlightenment, public education, starting at the youngest ages. Rather than allowing hate groups to fester, right, we try to promote far greater awareness from the very, very beginning.
Indeed.
I think there are very few countries on the planet which do as much as they could in terms of public education.
Yep.
And primary school education.
Yes, indeed. And that's our point. We'll leave it there at that, Eric, but we do sincerely, of course, appreciate you taking your time out of a busy schedule to speak to us here in Scope. That was Eric Heinze speaking to us from London. And as Eric there pointed out, of course, even at the end there, it's very important to be proactive, right? But as I put to him also, British Muslims, all the ones that I know at least, would want their country to be safe from any radicals or extremists as well, on their side would hope, I would imagine, that if there are any far-right extremists, that those on the other side would also do the same and would want their nation to be as safe for the rest of society as they would want for their own families and loved ones. So it's very important to deal with this situation head on, right? Because we've had, as I also said, Christchurch attack, the Halle synagogue attack, and there are countless other such examples. Anders Behring Breivik, for example, in Norway. We've had examples of where far-right extremism does translate into proper violent action, and that needs to be dealt with ASAP. And it is disturbing, certainly, that someone would use the COVID-19 pandemic, where people are dying because of a disease that we're all facing around the world, that all of our loved ones are being faced with, and yet would choose to take that and actually seek to divide us because of our ethnicity, faith, etc. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.